Daniel 6. Well, church, what can I say? We have finally arrived. We have finally arrived. Daniel and the lion's den. Perhaps the most famous narrative, most famous story of this entire book. Some might say of the entire Old Testament, even. The quintessential Daniel chapter is here. And fittingly, it comes at the end of the narrative half of the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel, of course, goes on, and we'll look at that in the coming weeks. But the narrative half, it climaxes here with this incredible account. Now, as a child, I must have colored in hundreds and hundreds of these coloring in sheets. Hands up if you have colored in one of these before, handed a sheet like this out. Yeah, most of us, right? This is the familiar scene, isn't it? Daniel smiling, the lion smiling, right? Perhaps Daniel praying or patting, one of the lovely lions, and King Darius looking there relieved and happy from on top. Everyone looking strangely excited and happy despite the fact that Daniel just spent the night surrounded by wild, hungry animals. But this is nonetheless the scene we get, what we tend to teach our children. But is that what Daniel 6 really is all about? Is that what it's all really about? Just another simple children's moral story telling us how to be brave, that we ought to be brave and not lose our faith. Well, yes, of course, it is certainly about faithfulness. But I dare suggest that Daniel 6 is darker than our Sunday school pictures suggest. There's politics, there's manipulation, there's violence, and there is more than one lion's den. More than one lion's den in this chapter. Yes, there is the literal lion's den at the end, but before that, there is the other den filled with ambitious, jealous, scheming officials. Daniel was in a lion's den well and truly before he went to the lion's den. The question for us this morning is, how does a servant of the living God remain faithful in a place like that? How are we supposed to do it? Daniel chapter 6. Actually, let's turn to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, to the last verse of Daniel 5. Daniel 5:31. Let's actually begin there. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay, do we remember last week? Do we remember the chapter that we looked at last Sunday? All right, Graham remembered. All right, thank you, Graham. So yes, it was about King Belshazzar, right? King Belshazzar, the vessels from the Jerusalem temple, and the disembodied hand, remember, that floated along the wall, writing on the wall. Just your typical Saturday night party. But how did it end? How did it end? With Babylon falling to the Persian Empire, who has now taken control, and with a new king on the throne, Darius the Mede. Now, that person on the screen is not Darius the Mede. That is just some random Persian king I found on Google Images. All right? We do not know much about Darius the Mede. It's a great mystery who Darius the Mede is. It's a great mystery, the identity of this figure. Yes, there are other King Dariuses. How do you say it? Something like that? In Persian Empire history. But they came later. But at this point in history, There was no King Darius. There was no King Darius. So scholars suggest that there are perhaps three possible, plausible identities of who this king actually may be. And the first one is that it may well be Cyrus himself, Cyrus the Persian king at the time. After all, if you read Daniel chapter 6, verse 28, it can be legitimately read as Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius. That is the reign of Cyrus the Persian. It can be translated from the Aramaic into English, just like that. So that's one possibility. Maybe Darius was actually Cyrus. Another possibility is that Darius was in fact a governor called Agbaru the Mede. Agbaru the Mede. According to other ancient sources, Agbaru was Cyrus's general who played a key role in the conquest of Babylon, and who was said in fact to have become the interim governor of Babylon straight after its fall to the Persians. Still, there is another possibility, and that is that Darius the Mede was simply Darius the Mede, someone who served, perhaps under Cyrus, but who has now become lost to history outside of the biblical text. That's, of course, perfectly plausible too. We cannot know for sure, and I'm certainly not going to try and solve a several thousand-year-old mystery right now. What we do know is, what is important for this chapter is that Babylon has changed hands. It's now a Persian, part of the Persian Empire. There is a new king, but it's not a new Daniel. It's the same Daniel. And it's not a new God. It's the same God as well. So Darius, he comes on board and does what Persian emperors, rulers became famous for doing. He set up a bureaucracy. Right? He must have been Canberran. I'm from Canberra, for those who do not know, so I say that in love. But yes, maybe he was a Canberran. 120 satraps or royal officials, and over them 3 senior administrators. Why? Well, verse 2 says, so that the king might suffer no loss. In other words, these administrators were there to protect the king's interests and to keep the machinery of the government running properly while the king did kingly stuff. Right? And one of those administrators was Daniel. Now, at this point, I just want to say, poor Daniel. I mean, seriously, give the guy a break. Right? He is probably somewhere around 80 to 85 years old in this chapter, right? In his early to mid 80s. Last week, Belshazzar, we looked at last week, Belshazzar apparently dragged him out of retirement to interpret the writing on the wall. Babylon then falls later that night, but instead of Daniel returning to retirement, he gets what everyone wants, another government job. Only now he's working for Persia. But again, Daniel excels. Verse 3 tells us, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. Daniel was capable, dependable, wise, trustworthy, faithful, so much so that Darius plans to set him above or over the whole kingdom. So in other words, not 3 administrators, just one administrator. Right? So just imagine it for a second, like Joseph under Pharaoh in Egypt in Genesis. Prime Minister Daniel overseeing the entire administration. of Babylon. That was the plan. That's what Darius wanted to do. But cue stage left, the lions. The lions begin circling. Not the lions in the den, but the lions within the political regime. Other officers are not impressed. Evidently, they were jealous. Evidently, they were ambitious. They didn't want to lose their jobs. They didn't want to bow before Daniel. And perhaps they didn't want Daniel, being nosy and checking in on perhaps some of their dealings that were perhaps less honorable than his. Whatever their exact motivation, Daniel stood between these men and something that they wanted. Power. Power. And so they investigate him. They search for corruption. No, can't find any. Negligence. No, can't find any of that. Dishonesty. Nope, nothing there. Anything they search. Can't find a thing. He's clean. They find nothing. Verse 4 says they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful. Because he was faithful. And there is our word for the morning. Faithful. Daniel was faithful to God, but he was also faithful to Darius, faithful in his work, faithful with his responsibilities. And so his enemies realize if they cannot turn Daniel's weakness against him, they will turn his strength against him. Verse 5, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. What an extraordinary statement. What a statement. They are going to force Daniel into a choice between two laws, the laws of Darius or the laws of God. And because they know Daniel, because they know him, they already know which one that he's going to refuse. They already know which one he's going to break. They are betting Daniel's life on his faithfulness. So the conspirators rush to Darius and tell him that all the officials have agreed on this amazing proposal, which of course can't literally be true because it didn't include Daniel, evidently. For 30 days, anyone making petition to any god or man except Darius is to be thrown into the lion's den. Now, this is a very strange decree, right? Let's be honest. This is a very strange decree. After all, Persian kings were not normally worshipped as gods, as, say, the pharaohs were in Egypt, for example. And Persia itself, as an empire, was generally quite tolerant of other religions. One plausible explanation is that for those 30 days, Darius was being established as this executive royal mediator, like a priest. He was being established as this executive priest through whom all of the religious petitions, all of the prayers from the land must go through him instead of any of the other priests. We can't know for sure. We can't know precisely the background, but whatever it was, it flattered Darius. He liked the sound of that. Everyone coming to him, everyone bringing their petitions before him. I mean, he was king, he was used to it, but more and more. It spoke to his ego. He was flattered. He was told that his entire administration supported it. And so the conspirators have created their crime, have set up the trap 30 days. But of course, they knew that they didn't need 30. Just day one would do. Verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God as he had previously done. As he had previously done. The law changed. Daniel did not. Daniel didn't go on and organize a protest. He didn't march into the palace demanding his rights. He just simply continued being Daniel. Continued to do what he had done for years and pray and pray and pray. And the conspirators knew exactly where to find him. Now, I don't think we need that imagination of them hiding outside of his house, peering through the open windows and seeing Daniel, politely positioned, praying by the side of his bed. Again, that's another very famous, very well-known children's colouring in sheet that has been handed out. I don't think we need to draw that, and I don't think you can draw that from this. What we read here is that they knew his routine. They didn't need to peer through the window. They knew his routine, and that was the whole point of the plan. They rush into his house and find him doing exactly what they knew that he would be doing. He was praying. No surprises there. They then return to Darius and frame Daniel's faithfulness to God as unfaithfulness to him. They say, look at this servant you wanted to promote. You can't trust him. But of course, the great irony of it all is that Daniel is not the unfaithful servant in this story. Who is? It's them. The ones who are accusing Daniel of being unfaithful. They're the ones who are deceiving Darius. They're the ones who are manipulating Darius. They're the ones who are using Darius. And Darius eventually picks up on it and realizes, I have been played. I have been played. Verse 14, once he understands what has happened, it says that he was greatly distressed and spends until sunset trying to rescue Daniel. Suddenly, Darius discovers that Daniel was not the only man surrounded by lions. He himself was trapped in his own political den. Eventually, Daniel is taken to the literal lion's den, and Darius says, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. Notice that description. Your God, whom you serve continually. Take note of it, because we're going to circle back to it in a few minutes. A stone is placed over the entrance. It is sealed. And Darius returns to the palace. He refuses entertainment. He cannot sleep. But do you see what he does do? He fasts. He fasts. Does he pray as well as fast? Probably. We can't be sure. Probably. To whom did he pray to? That's a whole other story. But he fasts. He holds on to hope that given the extraordinary faithfulness of Daniel, God's Daniel might perhaps come and deliver him in the end. So after that first night, Darius hurries back to the den and cries, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Notice how he says living God before he finds out whether or not Daniel is alive or not. Darius calls him the living God, before he even realizes, before he even knows. And then finally, Daniel speaks. Daniel speaks. I don't know if you've noticed yet, but Daniel has not said a single word in this entire chapter. Right? This is his cameo. This is his one line. "O King, live forever," a voice says from the den. "My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O King. I have done no harm." I wonder again if you can see the irony here. The conspirators assumed Daniel would have to betray either God or Darius, but Daniel here says, "No, I've done neither." And verse 23 tells us why. Because he had trusted in God the whole time. Daniel was faithful. Daniel trusted God, and God had been faithful to Daniel. Then comes the part they usually leave off the coloring in sheet. Some of you know what I'm talking about, right? The men who maliciously accuse Daniel are themselves thrown into the den together with their families. Brutal stuff. But the point is clear. The judgment was reversed. The trap that they had built for Daniel, they fell into it themselves. And once again, the chapter concludes like Nebuchadnezzar before him in earlier chapters. Darius issues a proclamation honoring Daniel's God as the living God, enduring forever, whose kingdom shall never be destroyed, who delivers and rescues and works signs and wonders. Right? In other words, kings come and go, empires come and go, laws come and go. But here is this man, this king, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that it is the living God who endures forever. Let's return for a moment to verse 10. Jump back with me to verse 10. Because this really is the crux of the chapter. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in the upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Notice here how Daniel knelt, how he kneels. The Jews, the Hebrews, they didn't usually do that. They did not usually do that. That was not normal. In fact, only 3 times in the entire Old Testament are people explicitly described as kneeling in prayer. And it is utterly fascinating when you find out who they are. Solomon, Daniel, and Ezra. Solomon, he kneels before God before the exile. Daniel during the exile, and Ezra soon after the exile. When Solomon dedicated the temple, he knelt and prayed about the very situation that Daniel found himself in. In 1 Kings 8, Solomon asks, what would happen if God's people sinned, were defeated and carried away into another land? He prayed that if from exile they'd turn toward Israel, towards Jerusalem and the temple and pray, He prayed that God would hear their prayer and forgive and restore them. He even asks God, verse 50 of 1 Kings 8, grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive. Now, fast forward a couple of generations. Jerusalem has fallen. The temple has indeed been destroyed. God's people are in exile. And there is Daniel on his knees, facing Jerusalem, praying. With who? With who showing him compassion? Who was? Darius. Daniel is doing exactly what Solomon prayed God's people would do if they ever found themselves in exile. Daniel will serve Darius, but he will never pray to or through him. Daniel will honor Darius, but he will never dishonor God. Daniel will stand in Darius's court and advise him, but he will never let Darius stand between him and his Lord. And then here come perhaps the two most surprising words of this entire chapter. Gave thanks. Gave thanks. Daniel gave thanks. For what? For what? Political enemies trying to have him killed? We're not told what Daniel thanked God for. But perhaps, just perhaps, the direction of his body as he was praying gives us a clue. Daniel could look toward the ruined Jerusalem, the ruined temple, a homeland he had not seen in decades, and nonetheless still give thanks because those ruins did not mean that God had broken his promises. Daniel may live, Daniel may die, but God remained faithful. And remembering God's faithfulness during the exile gave Daniel resolve to remain faithful himself. This brings me to two very simple lessons for us today. Two very simple lessons for us today that I believe the author of Daniel really wanted us to observe and to think about, to ponder upon at the end of the chapter. And the first one is quite simply to marvel at Daniel's faithfulness. Just to marvel at it. Just to stop and appreciate it and say, wow, who is this guy? What a man, what an 80-year-old. Daniel did not suddenly become faithful when crisis arrived. The text says he had gone on and did what he had previously done. The law changed, but Daniel didn't. The lions didn't create Daniel's faithfulness. They revealed it. For decades, he had remained faithful through changing kings, changing empires, political pressure, and exile. And so I think one of the lessons here, one of the things that we can observe in this chapter is simply pause and to marvel, because I think we do not often do that enough. Give thanks for faithful people who have gone before us. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, missionaries, martyrs, parents, grandparents, ordinary brothers and sisters in Christ whose names history might know or whose names have been lost to history, but names that God knows. We should be giving thanks for them. We should stop and marvel at them from time to time and say, wow, just wow, and learn from their example. I think that is one very obvious conclusion, one very obvious lesson for us today. The second one, perhaps not so easy. Marvel at Daniel's faithfulness, but then question our own. Question our own. Daniel's enemies hated him. Daniel's enemies hated him, but they knew him. They knew that if prayer became illegal, Daniel would pray anyway. Their entire plot depended upon Daniel continuing to be Daniel. Could that be said of us? Could our family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, even those who don't particularly like us too much, can they predict our faithfulness? Would they say, he will tell the truth? She will pray. No, they won't compromise on that. They serve the living God. Most of us will never face actual lions, and for that, I give thanks. But we will face lions' dens, work situations, family situations, moments when honesty costs us something, times when following Jesus makes us stand out and unusual. Daniel 6 asks, who will we be when we enter the den? And I dare say, the answer will usually be determined by who we were before we entered it. After all, as the author wrote here about Daniel, as he had previously done. Of course, we need to remember Daniel 3 in this. Faithfulness does not guarantee that God will always come to the rescue in whatever way we might want him to do. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, just go ask them. But what did they say? They said before Nebuchadnezzar, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us if you throw us into that fiery furnace. But then they go on to say, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow to you. God delivered Daniel from the lions. Other faithful servants have died. Sometimes God rescues from suffering. Sometimes God carries us through it. And sometimes our final rescue may just be at the final resurrection. But that does not mean that the living God and faithful God is not living and faithful. We remain faithful to him because he has first been faithful to us. So here is the question. Darius called Daniel servant of the living God whom you serve continually. Can that be said of you? Can that be said of us? Put your name there. Put your own name there. Peter, servant of the living God whom you serve continually. Put your own name there. Is it true? Not just occasionally true. Not only on Sundays do we serve continually. Not only when obedience costs us nothing, but whom we serve continually. If that question troubles you this morning, then let me encourage you to do what Daniel did. And when you get home, fall on your knees and pray. Pray. Find somewhere quiet. Kneel, north, south, east, west, doesn't matter. Remember what God has done and promised. Bring your fears and the different lions' dens that are around you before him. Ask the Holy Spirit to strengthen you, and remember, just remember who you serve. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of Moses and David. The God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The God of Daniel. The God who has revealed himself in all of his love, glory, and holiness in Jesus Christ our Lord. Our living God, the living God, the God of you, the God of me. Let me close with Darius's words at the very end of this chapter. This is his praise, a pagan king praising God. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Daniel served God continually, faithfully. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, the different lions' dens, the literal lion's den. The question is, can we do the same? Will we do the same? Could it be true of us what was said of Daniel? That we are servants of the living God who serve him continually.